Inez.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And I'm Will Chamberlain.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So per usual, we have a great lineup of topics for you today. We're also trying out a bit of a new format this week, and hopefully you'll like it. Give us feedback. You like it, you don't like it. We are still going to have our 4 segments, but we're going to have a more conversational feel and a little bit more of a back and forth between the 4 of us. So the topics today, Will is going to kick us off. We're going to be talking, of course, about Donald Trump, about his trial in New York. Then we're going to move to Ben, who's going to give us a bit of an update on whether or not we're going to have any presidential debates in this election season. Third, we're going to go to Amber, where the Biden administration is promulgating rules that are going to force hospitals and businesses to provide quote unquote affirming care for transgender patients. And then finally, I'm going to talk about a little bit about the state of cancellation as it exists now, whether it's as strong as it used to be in light of an article in the Guardian that doxes a major online figure. So with that, I'm going to kick it to Will to start us off today.
Yeah, so obviously Trump is still on trial in New York for supposed falsification of business records. Michael Cohen, I believe, is on the stand today. He was on the stand yesterday. He's currently in the middle of cross-examination. Basically, it looks like the prosecution is going to wrap up and pretty shortly here with its witnesses, and we'll have the end of defense. We'll have defense witnesses come up. My quick take is I doubt that they've actually proved a crime just at all. I think that theoretically this could be dismissed outright if the judge were fair, but obviously the judge is not fair. My other big take is it's just this week is Michael Cohen coming back into the scene, and I think he's the single most despicable figure in the entire saga of Russiagate and impeachments and whatever, because to me he's the guy who sold out his client for to make money. Like, I think that he made something like $3.4 million off his books, and the basic substance of his books was, I'm going to sell out my confidences. So I don't know. I won't, we can start, I guess, there in terms of people coming into the conversation. What do you guys think of Michael Cohen's testimony? And do you think I am right that he's the single most despicable figure in the entire Trump drama? So whoever wants to take that.
I don't know if he's the single most despicable, but he definitely is despicable. I mean, just objectively, right? He's been posting throughout this entire trial all of these deranged memes about Trump in an orange jumpsuit behind bars, which the judge wouldn't even issue an official gag order for him on that. He just basically gave him a warning that he shouldn't talk about the trial anymore, whereas Trump is fined $1,000+ daily for, posting things on Truth Social. He's also an admitted liar, and then lied about lying, because during the civil trial with Trump, right, he had already pleaded guilty to lying to Congress. And then during the civil trial, he testifies on the stand that in that plea, which also included pleading guilty to tax evasion, that he didn't actually evade his taxes, which you can't plead guilty to something and then under oath say, but I didn't actually do it. I mean, right. This guy is just such a clown. I loved the Wall Street Journal's headline this morning. I think they summed it up pretty well in terms of what the Trump team is doing to Cohen, which is defense paints Trump's ex-fixer as a foe obsessed with revenge. I mean, that's really the heart of the issue.
Yeah, no, I had another good friend who's a lawyer, Shipwreck Crew. He made a point first about how, as a prosecutor, if any element of the crime is going to be based on a testimony of someone who's a perjurer like that, you shouldn't be bringing it in the first place, because you can't beyond a reasonable doubt say they're telling the truth. And yeah, I think I forgot the second thing I was going to say, but yeah, the guy's the guy's been lying repeatedly under oath for a very long time. So there's really no reason you should just take his testimony as golden, and it's ridiculous that we're being forced to. I don't know. Go ahead.
It's really it's a further proof that this is just a parade of testimony for essentially the election, right? The same thing was with Stormy Daniels' testimony, which is totally not necessary in the context of what they're actually trying to establish for the crime, right? The crime here is about whether Trump recorded these payments correctly under New York law. There's not actually a need to bring Stormy Daniels in and talk about, salacious things that did or didn't happen with Trump. and in fact, like Andy McCarthy has pointed out, like that makes it more difficult for him to get on the stand as well, because he's going to want to address, or there's going to be an expectation from the jury that he says whether those things are true or not, as opposed to like narrowing this to the scope of the actual trial and the actual alleged crime involved, which is really cobbled together with 2 pieces of chewing gum and a piece of floss. So, I mean, it just underlies the fact that the point of this trial is not to establish facts under the law. Like, that's not what's happening. It's just a parade of people to testify against Donald Trump and to try to hurt him in the election. I don't know. I do have to add, though, that Trump has a habit of surrounding himself with people like Michael Cohen. And it's a major negative. It's a major negative for him. It has screwed him before in the past. I mean, this is like, I know nobody remembers Omarosa from the first administration, but Trump really has a habit of surrounding himself with people who are grifters, who are dishonest, who are probably because they tell him what he wants to hear. And that, you know, when people talk about Donald Trump's character, that's one character aspect. I'm much less concerned about the sort of moralizing around his life. But I am concerned about this character flaw of his, which is he seems to prefer to surround himself with people who parrot what he wants to hear back to him. And that just by nature attracts a lot of dishonest grifters. And a lot of those dishonest grifters turn around and, you know, become a problem for Donald Trump.
I'll say he's doing a better job now on the hiring lawyers front. Like, I think one of the things, you know, this is where he's taking a lot of the advice of my colleague, Mike Davis, and bringing in better people. Like, that's one of the reasons he had such a good appellate counsel. John Sauer did a good job on the presidential immunity case. He's getting better lawyers. Like, hiring Cohen is a strange person to have around. I mean, also, like, there's other things that just happen in the news and you hear them, you're like, wait, what? I mean, I don't know if Ben's a lawyer too, right? I think, Ben, you went to law school, right?
I just play one here. That's it.
Just play one. Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, in any event, dude, recorded his client's conversation, right? Recorded a conversation with his client. Now, I'm sitting here as just a lawyer thinking to myself, I would not ever do that. There are circumstances where you might record some interaction with opposing counsel if you're trying to nail them down on something that they're doing. But you'd like never, ever record a conversation with your client, who your job is to preserve their confidences inviolate. And not only did Cohen record the conversation, he kept the recording and then released it. And all of a sudden he's supposed to say, like, this is the virtue, this is what I mean when I talk about he's the most despicable figure. As a lawyer, it's drilled into you not to do this stuff, that your duty of loyalty to your client is the most important thing. And he just spit all over that and then expected everybody to praise him for it.
Lest we forget that the other side is also full of degenerate grifters and people who are completely unprofessional. It was in this trial, right, where the prosecution admitted that they erased evidence on the stand, like on the record in the courtroom, they admitted that they erased evidence. Or was this in one of Trump's many other trials that I'm...
In the documents
I think that was the documents case in Florida.
Yeah. Yes, okay. That's one of the other trials, but like...
Well, can I just say, though, that is like...
relatively unprofessional.
But that is kind of the virtue of the lawfare. I mean, not that there's necessarily going to be justice on this earth or cosmic justice ultimately for what I would call the lawfare inquisitionists, or maybe we should call them insurrectionists. One after another of these cases. Okay, so this case, the records case, where they can't even define what the underlying crimes are that turn this from a misdemeanor where the statute of limitations lapsed into the felony of the century, and they're relying on a serial perjurer and a porn star, but not even really to prove the case, just to toxify Donald Trump because they think this is going to hurt him politically. And then you have even people on the left who are pulling their hair out about what's gone on in the proceedings because they realize it's not working and it's damaging. So this is one case with Mershon being corrupted in the way that he is, and a Biden donor, and his daughter working with all sorts of Democrats who have vested interest in the case, and supposedly Dan Goldman working to prep Michael Cohen multiple times, and then a number 3 at the Justice Department at one point who parachutes in to prosecute the case. So you have the coordination with the Biden White House as well. Then you have Jack Smith, who is the ultimate zealot, who's been smacked down by the Supreme Court unanimously I think on multiple occasions when he's engaged in these jihads against Republican figures, oftentimes. And then you have the whole Fani Willis saga. So one after another, every one of these cases is led by people who are more unhinged and or corrupt and or zealots than the next. And it just exposes obviously how disingenuous the whole operation is. And once again shows the level of projection at unseen heights involved in all of them, because all of the people involved are co-conspirators and really the ultimate conspiracy against the republic of all. And they have to concoct these cases against Trump, despite the fact that this is the most investigated guy in the history of mankind, and they can't find anything. So they need to conjure up quote unquote novel cases, the likes of which we've never seen before. And they still find themselves getting thwarted and not getting to trial in the cases they really want to go to trial right now. So again, there's no necessarily justice on this earth for it, but it is incredibly telling just how corrupted they are and how much they expose themselves in their zealotry.
Yeah, I mean,
Inez was right, by the way. Just sorry, really quick, but in this case, the prosecution did admit to erasing or losing audio files between Michael Cohen and Keith Davidson, who was the lawyer for Karen McDougal, who was the other, I guess, Playboy model or whatever that Trump was accused of having an affair with. Cohen apparently had several angry phone calls with that lawyer about a story about the affair running in the media after he had supposedly made a payment to stop it. And the recordings of those phone calls are gone.
Of course, I'm not surprised at all. Yeah, I mean, this stuff isn't working. We're about to obviously going to move over to Ben and the debate announcement, but like a lot of this, Trump is doing great. Like the polls are incredible for him right now, and despite the fact that he's going through all this lawfare, and I think one, it's the obvious of injustice of it all. But the final point I'll make is, I have a never Trump friend who said he's going to finally pull the lever for Trump, and he made an interesting point that the combination of the gag order and the unfairness of this all means that like Trump is actually restrained in what he can say, and then you have like all these surrogates coming in to defend him, and it's also like it's kind of just making him seem more and more presidential, and the other side seem more and more unfair, and it's just creating this terrible polling situation for Biden, which is why I think, well, Inez will handle the transition here, but we'll move on.
Yeah, all I'm going to say is that I said there was a non-trivial chance that Trump will be elected from a jail cell, and I'm feeling pretty good about that possibility. I feel like it's rising. The potential for that possibility is rising by the week. With that, we're going to talk about a little bit more about the state of the race with Ben telling us a little bit about how perhaps we actually will have a debate this election cycle.
I think in what's a clear reflection of the fact that Joe Biden feels he has to debate as a consequence of recent polling that we've seen, for example, with Trump winning by huge margins in all of the swing states, essentially. And that's been a consistent trend in the cycle. We got word today, we're recording on Wednesday, that Joe Biden had written a letter to the quote unquote bipartisan Commission on Presidential Debates saying he's not going to adhere to their schedule, but he wants to have 2 debates against Donald Trump. He puts out this 14-second really macho video where he says, "Make my day, pal." 5+ jump cuts in this 14-second video, meaning it was almost impossible for him to string together approximately a couple sentences to say that he wants to debate Donald Trump. In the letter to the commission, he lays out all of the stipulations that he has, and the stipulations are really notable, and maybe we can talk about each of them or any of them that you guys think are the most salient. But among other things, what he asks for is that it only be on one of 4 networks, the 2 debates that the Biden camp is calling for: CBS News, ABC News, CNN, and Telemundo. So really Trump-friendly outlets there. He also calls for no audience, that there be your mic is cut when you're not talking, and only a single moderator as well. Apparently, both Trump and Biden have agreed to this first CNN debate towards the end of June. CNN puts their own conditions on it, including among them that you have to be on the ballot in enough states to be able to get the 270 plus electoral votes. So as well as that you have to, I think, be polling at 15% or more in 4 polls. So Joe Biden does not want RFK Jr. debating. That's one of the things that his campaign has indicated. We'll see if he hits the threshold in the CNN debate or in any future ones. Trump has responded calling for not just the 2 debates, he wants 4 debates, one in June, July, August, and September. And this is especially important, obviously, because there is no election day anymore. We're talking about election weeks and months at this point. So all that said, what do you guys make of the fact that Biden has come out and said he wants the debates? And then what do you think about Trump essentially saying, I'll debate him anytime, anywhere, and with any moderator, he indicated to you it, when he's going to be in the Lion's Den against basically playing an away game to the extent he's debating anywhere that Joe Biden has demanded?
I think I'll start out here. I think it's good for Trump. Clearly the Biden team wouldn't be debating if they were up 10 on all these polls. They just wouldn't. I mean, they could easily say to Trump, you wouldn't debate your opponents in the primary, so we're not going to debate you now. We don't have to. Everybody knows you, the 2 of you. They're the former incumbent presidents. So the fact that they want debates means they're desperate. I actually don't think the rules are going to hurt Trump at all. I remember the first debate in 2020 when Trump was really aggressively interrupting Biden a lot and kind of being pretty belligerent about it. And I think it hurt him a lot. I think that first debate was really not very good for Trump. And so I think this is one of those times he's agreeing to a rule constraint that'll help him, that'll prevent him from being obnoxious. And I also don't think it's bad to have a hostile moderator. I think one of the things Trump does really well is actually handle hostile moderators and make their bias obvious. I mean, you can still remember, like, why did Trump really skyrocket in 2016? Well, it was when Megyn Kelly, told him about all the horrible things he had said about women. And he was like, hold up his hand. And he's like, only Rosie O'Donnell. And it was, that was the moment that just like the entire audience laughs and everything. So I think it'll be good for him, but I'm curious what you guys think.
That's the thing. It's kind of notable that he's constrained by being in court all the time, but in a perverse way, it sort of almost elevates his comments because he comes out of court every day and that's like the big press conference. And that is in effect like a national campaign rally. So in a perverse way, being limited in his speech and having to be dealing in an adversarial sort of context there is probably helpful. But one question maybe for you, Will or Inez, is to what extent do the gag orders in the J6 case and also the New York case impact what he's going to be able to say during the debates?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And the secondary follow-up will be whether or not he's actually going to listen to those. Because he shouldn't, frankly, if he's going to be on the debate stage with people, and ask questions that are highly relevant in the presidential context, I would leave that to a law, like a First Amendment lawsuit, if they want to try to put him in jail for that. I would not. This is clearly not about the law and very clearly about the election. And I think he's right to treat it that way to some extent. Although that, again, sometimes has its limits. Like maybe you shouldn't deliberately antagonize every single judge you go before. But generally speaking, I think that's just a recognition of the reality that it's not law, it's politics. And that's a really sad thing. And we've talked about why it's dangerous for the country many, many times on here, but it is what it is. And he needs to react to that reality. I don't know.
I want to interrupt real quick because
Yeah,
there's like one specific thing he can do right on this point is that he can just yell at Joe Biden and tell him to pack it up and stop hounding him with his prosecutors. Right. Because like, I don't think there's a gag order on him criticizing his primary political opponent. So he can just be like, call off your dogs. Like, and if you won't do that, you're a coward because you don't actually want to win this election fair and square. He's got a ton of ground if it comes up at all.
I wouldn't underestimate on two fronts here. Sort of, I know that we feel good about some of this, that the trials aren't hurting Trump in the polls. If anything, they're helping him in the polls. Maybe it's because he's somewhat restrained the way that Ben was talking about and Will was talking about. I don't know. Maybe it's because the pervasive unfairness of the way that this is happening in the courtroom is actually working to his favor. I still wouldn't underestimate how much money and time is getting poured into these lawsuits and the opportunity costs of that. I mean, Trump is like a rally guy, right? And those rallies do, I mean, especially now that the Republican Party is counting on votes that are, as the professional class moves more and more Democrat, those are reliable voters. Those are people who show up and vote every single election. Now, high turnout elections actually benefit Republicans, which is sort of a reversal of the conventional wisdoms of our politics for the last 30 years. And these are people who are a little bit disconnected from the political process, right? So who need to be reminded that it's time to vote, or need to, have a rally near them to sort of come out for Donald Trump, who they're way more connected to than other Republican candidates. So I wouldn't underestimate how much that's hurting him, even if it's not like directly hurting him in the polls. And the second thing is I wouldn't underestimate Joe Biden in the debates, because the bar is now so low on the floor. I mean, you mentioned like, what was it, 5 cuts in 14 seconds? If he strings together a single sentence under the influence of stimulants, he's already clearing the expectations for himself. I also think Joe Biden, leaving aside his cognitive issues and his age, which are an enormous problem for him, I think Joe Biden is the last Democrat who can kind of make himself sound moderate, even as his administration does wildly immoderate things, both in domestic and foreign policy. I don't know if you go back to any of the states of the union he's given, you would have no idea that, for example, his administration is on the cutting edge of forcing all of these very unpopular cultural issues down everybody's throats. And we're going to talk about that in the next segment. But you would have no idea, listening to Joe Biden's State of the Union, that that's what his administration is doing. So I wouldn't totally put the bar on the floor for Joe Biden. If he can get the right stimulants and string together a few sentences, it's possible that these debates could help him.
I think you're right, Inez, because we all kind of had the same calculus going into the 2020 debates, where we were like, Biden's basement Joe, and he's going to like totally destroy himself on that stage. And because he was mildly coherent and we had set all of these expectations for him blowing up spectacularly, people kind of thought, okay, maybe it's not as bad as everyone's saying that it is. And I think barring some like major event, like him literally crapping himself on stage, people are going to view it as a victory. Not impossible, especially if he's on as many drugs as he might need to be to get through an hour and a half, 2-hour debate. But I was really surprised with this news that came out this week about the debate negotiations, that Biden is abandoning the Commission on Presidential Debates. I never thought that a Democrat would do that. Trump has obviously spoken quite forcefully against the commission's bias, which has been quite evident. But Democrats have been happy to hide behind them for a long time. And I think there's 2 reasons for it, one of which was already mentioned, which is that Biden does not want RFK's participation. And he probably feels more confident that negotiating directly with these networks, that he can make sure that doesn't happen. And the other thing is that outside of whatever rules Biden has placed in that letter and whatever rules CNN has offered, the Biden and Trump campaigns also have to negotiate one-on-one about what specifically the rules are going to be. And so that still kind of gives Biden an opportunity to weasel out of the debates by saying, negotiations broke down, Trump was being totally unreasonable, we simply cannot have a debate like this. It still gives him an easy way to get out of it, because he doesn't have this so-called bipartisan body handling the negotiations and the rules. He can really just lay all of the blame at the Trump campaign's feet.
It's a great point. And the last one that I'll add to it is another out that he has is if Trump gets convicted in New York, does Joe Biden say, I'm not going to stand on stage with a convicted felon?
And on that note, I'm going to turn it back over to Amber to talk about yet another immoderate policy coming out of the Biden administration.
Yeah, so the Biden administration has obviously done a lot to affect policy through federal rulemaking. We've seen this on Title IX with the way that they have included gender identity in its Title IX rules, so that schools have to affirm essentially transgender students in order to not violate federal law, in order to get federal funding. And he's now expanded that to other agencies, including HHS. So hospitals now are potentially being forced to provide quote unquote gender affirming care to minors under the inclusion of gender identity into its rules against discrimination under the Civil Rights Act. And he's also done this through the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So businesses basically have to allow men, for example, to use bathrooms labeled for women if they identify as women. Any business that has more than 15 employees. There are lawsuits against both of these new policies. There are 18 Republican states suing the EEOC, and a Mississippi healthcare clinic is suing HHS for its rule. But this is a very clever and entrenched way for Biden to basically inculcate these very progressive ideas of gender into the federal bureaucracy through rulemaking without any of this having to pass through Congress. The Biden administration is obviously using the Bostock ruling as like the grounds for this. And it's not only gender, but race as well. A couple of weeks ago on this podcast, I talked about the EEOC's lawsuit against Sheetz for not wanting to hire certain criminals, which they said had a disparate impact on racial minorities because they tend to commit more of certain types of crimes. So across the board, a lot of rulemaking going on that could be unwound by a future administration, but obviously takes a lot of time and work and effort. And just want to know what you guys think about some of the lawsuits and their potential for success, and also just sort of the insidious nature of what the Biden admin is doing here.
Yeah, I mean, this is very clearly well beyond agency power. And now we have a court that looks askance at that kind of unbridled agency power. That being said, I mean, you can't rely on the Supreme Court to take every single case. There's still plenty of circuits beneath them that will make the wrong ruling repeatedly. And so it's not a it's not a Band-Aid. It's just like something to keep in the back of your mind. But yeah, this is going to be a massive problem. The Title IX regs that dropped about 3 weeks ago, it's not just Title IX. And now they're of course, in the EEOC, they're citing Bostock and updating under Title VII. And that's what this is that Amber is referring to. But there's also a gazillion citations to both of those pieces of law, of anti-discrimination law, in thousands of places in federal and state law, right? So like one of those places, for example, is Obamacare, where they cite the Title IX standard for discrimination on the basis of sex. Like that's in Obamacare. That's the standard that hospitals and insurance companies are supposed to live up to when it comes to anti-discrimination. Now, the federal government now officially says that discrimination includes discrimination on the basis of quote unquote gender identity, right? So you can see how this replicates, and that's just the beginning. There are hundreds or thousands of state laws that reference federal anti-discrimination law as a baseline for example, getting state funds, right? So it's going to be a massive undertaking, both in the courtroom and out of it, to untangle some of this stuff and see where it applies, where it doesn't. There are some good things happening on this front from the 10,000 foot perspective, though. First of all, we have somebody, and by we, I mean sane people everywhere, has somebody on the EEOC. Andrea Lucas, Commissioner Andrea Lucas, she's come out and written against these, which is like unusual to see an EEOC commissioner come out and like start writing about this stuff. And she's also written some really interesting letters and op-eds and like sort of statements about how the Supreme Court's recent rulings about whether or not diversity set-asides, affirmative action, those kinds of programs are actually compatible with either the CRA or with the Constitution. And she's starting to look at, okay, well, if that's the case, then can a private company have this kind of diversity initiative? So actually going on the offense, we talked about that Sheetz case with Amber a couple weeks ago. That's on the defense, right? It's saying, no, of course, a company can decide they don't want to hire felons, even if that disproportionately means that some racial groups are more impacted by that than others, right? That's defensive. We have a commissioner who's looking at the offensive applications at a lot of these diversity programs. I think Congress is looking at that as well. And so I do think there's some room for some good news, especially in the private sector, because even though the Supreme Court was ruling about universities, right? Universities are ideological, they're dug in, It's pretty clear they're going to do the best they can to try to circumvent some of these restrictions on affirmative action and sort of diversity admissions, right? Same thing happened in California. The state officially barred affirmative action. It's been the law of the land for a decade and a half. And California universities aggressively practice affirmative action, right? So it's going to be difficult to enforce in the university context, but I think in the private sector context and with the potential of lawsuits and the sort of CYA attitude, I actually have more hope that so there are things going in the negative direction as they always are, and Amber's right to point to this. For the first time, I think there are some mechanisms going in the opposite direction in terms of enforcement in a positive direction, and we should be keeping an eye on those as well.
I also interestingly got an email in my inbox this week from a PR firm that was shopping some poll that they had done of businesses and what they're doing in reaction to this. It was from the pro-trans perspective. So they were like, oh my gosh, look at all these businesses that are willing to discriminate against trans people because they won't let them use the women's bathroom. But the poll found that something like 25 to 30% of the businesses that they talked to said that they were just not going to comply with this. And so, like, on the other end of the spectrum, you're also going to have, trans activists being required to sue businesses en masse in order to actually get them to enforce this new Biden policy. So it kind of cuts both ways, I guess.
I mean, maybe, but I don't know. Like, I suspect they'll just be belligerent. If you can count on Democrats, and especially institutional Democrats, to do anything, it's to find ways to wield power of the state to harass.
Masterpiece cake shops, like the perfect example.
Exactly. Like that's what this is. This is Masterpiece Cake Shops. This is little sisters of the poor. Like, you name the way they do it. It's like, how can we force, small little business owner or random little nun to go against their conscience and obey our moral dictates? Like, that's just a fundamental impulse driving the left on cultural issues. It's like, oh, somehow, somewhere, there's someone who won't bake a cake for a gay wedding with, like a diagram of Satan on it. So, like, clearly we need, stop the presses. We need to deal with that person. And it's like, once you understand that that's part of the motivating force to the left, it's like, oh yes, this is why friends don't want friends over Democrats. This is why we don't let Democrats have control of the executive branch. This is why, talking to like people like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to vote for Trump or Biden. It's like, you're not just voting for Biden, you're voting for all those apparatchiks at the DOJ and EEOC to ruin the lives of people like you. That's what you're voting for.
The question in response to that is, I have kind of two political questions on this, setting aside the substance. Why aren't Republicans anywhere really, seemingly that I'm aware of at least, running on the agenda of Biden is engaged in a war on parents, on women, on girls? Like, why isn't the sanity agenda out there at all? And then the opposite, because this is obviously, to me, this seems like at least like an 80-20 kind of issue in favor of common sense and reasonableness and genuine normalcy. And then the other question is, on the Biden side, why does the Biden side feel compelled to push this now? And part of it is, like, to Will's point, they always push. They're always progressing. They're always going to push it as far as they possibly can. But not everything be damned, because, I mean, there are ideologues, obviously, who are zealous and maybe don't care about the political implications. But obviously, the Biden camp, to the extent there is a Biden camp, does care about the politics of everything. So do they think that this turns out some percentage of voters that they feel they need, or does it keep progressive groups off their back who would otherwise be up in arms and outraged that he hasn't done enough? So they feel like they have to do this to sew up a constituency or protect themselves from attacks from their left flank? Or is this just about getting it on the books while he's still in office? Because in an absolute catastrophic worst case scenario, you set the precedent here and you create landmines, or at least you tie up a Trump administration in trying to rescind these rules and regs. So my question is kind of the political one. Why aren't Republicans running on this? And why do we think that Joe Biden is pushing this now?
So I think I have at least a partial answer to both of those questions. Working backwards, one, the reason this is happening now, actually the answer to that is because, and I've said a lot on this show and elsewhere about my disappointment with how the Trump administration handled bureaucracy and handled the deep state and handled, administrative responsibilities generally. this is one instance where they did a really good job. They crossed the T's and they dotted the I's. The DeVos administration under Trump basically made it administratively impossible for the Biden administration to do this quickly. So this was a day one priority, and it's taken them this long. I do not think the political side is happy with that. And that's why we saw them delay some of those regs until after the midterms. And they're trying to do the same thing by trying to carve out women's sports from this. They're saying they're going to do a separate rulemaking on women's sports. That's not correct. Like, their administration is out there in federal court saying this applies to women's sports. So like, it's a lie, but I don't think this is something coming from the political. I don't think they want to deal with this. And consequently, that's kind of the answer to number two. And it doesn't explain why Republicans are not constantly harping on it, but that's, you know, sort of a general problem with the Republican Party. But like, they want this squashed. I don't know if you guys noticed, this did not get any coverage in mainstream media at all. There was no celebration about trans rights, none of it. It very clearly, the order went out. Don't talk about Title IX. Don't talk about Title VII. Don't talk about the EEOC. Don't talk about what this does to Obamacare. Don't talk, like, there was no celebration. I think
it was so hard to find an article. I was writing about this yesterday, and I was Googling just EEOC, like trans rules. And the only articles were once the lawsuits were filed against it.
Yep. And so I do think we'll have an opportunity to talk about this again August 1st. I don't know when the EEOC, Amber, do you know when the EEOC, when this goes into effect? Is it immediate?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Well, August 1st is when the Title IX stuff goes into effect. So in the upcoming school year, these regulations will be in effect unless a court stays them. So once schools have to comply, and remember, this is kindergarten through law school, right? So once schools have to comply with this, and there are states that say they will not comply, to Amber's point about businesses, but I think it'll be another opportunity for everybody to say, like, hey, like, the Biden administration did this. But I don't think the politicals wanted this at all. I think this is something they set in motion on day one. And because of the way that the APA is structured and the rulemaking process, and the fact that the Trump administration did a good job of really kind of sealing up the ball so that they had to go through all of this full rulemaking procedure. I don't think they wanted to do it now. I think it's like they had to do it, period, because their activists wanted them to, but they had to do it now because that's how long it took them to get there. And then to go through, by the way, like, shout out to my organization, IW, like, to go through the hundreds and thousands of comments, negative comments, and like administratively, like, they have to do that. So it basically, we slowed this down until now, and that's why we're talking about it now. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and transition to our last segment here about cancellation, about doxing. So The Guardian had an article out about internet guy about town Lomez, also the founder of Passage Press, which has published Steve Saylor, among other things. Other people, has published Curtis Yarvin. It's just a upstart sort of right-wing press shop, actually buying up some really interesting titles. As an aside, this piece in The Guardian lists, among other evidence that this is, a fascist, Nazi, press shop or whatever, lists generals that fought on the white side of the Russian Civil War, like, versus the Reds, right? Apparently that itself, fighting against Bolsheviks, makes you a Nazi and a fascist. They bought up some of those titles. Anyway, it's a really interesting publishing house. I highly recommend people check out Passage Press. But the question I wanted to bring up with is, there's this whole doxing piece, which basically amounts to a few tweets about Kyle Rittenhouse that wouldn't, and journalists that wouldn't shock your average Fox News viewer. They're not controversial at all, what they ended up digging up about Lomez. And then followed by, 700 words of all of the really creepy stalker behavior that this guy, Jason Wilson in The Guardian, engaged in, like looking up, Lomez's high school basketball team. I mean, matching like the obituaries of his father, like, calling his wife and harassing her, just like really low behavior. And the response to it has largely been pushback / a big shrug. Like, nobody cares about this. So I'm wondering, for you guys, where you think we are in this cancellation, because I'm kind of on two minds on it. On the one hand, I think it's a good thing. We're definitely hardening up. If you think about Richard Hanania is the last one that they tried to cancel for some of this, and the stuff they brought out, that he had written it before under a fake name was way more controversial than any of the stuff that they found on Lomez. But he's still here. He still published his book with a mainstream publisher, right? Has a corner turned, and to what extent? Because this article points out they've discovered this shocking fact that like Lomez is a successful guy with a beautiful wife and lots of kids, and like who had an academic career and then a career at Google. Now he's doing his own project, and that's the only reason this doesn't matter, right? So like we can all say this doesn't matter, but if he was still at Google, he'd be fired. He'd be losing his job. A father of I think he has 5 kids, right? He'd be losing his job. If he was still in academia, he'd be under sanction and he'd be going through everything Amy Wax is going through. So, to say that cancellation is sort of over, I think we do have more antibodies against it. I think the average person is really, really sick of it. But at the same time, the institutions, if you are reliant in any way on a like mainstream or particularly left-leaning networks, or I think cancellation is kind of as bad as it's ever been. So I don't know what you guys think about that.
I think it's better. I think things are definitely better. I saw there was an interesting story that I followed on that found me on Twitter about in San Francisco. There's this education startup that's trying to promote software for high achieving very young children, teach them how to read, and some author tried to write a cancellation piece saying it's like, oh, you're trying to turn children to slave labor. And what happened is the company suddenly, which had not even put out a product yet, just had a bunch of sales that it wasn't even prepared for and is now getting out to launch. We have this and I think Lomez has gained something like 20 or 30,000 followers as a result of the cancellation, or the attempt. Rather, these are almost acting more like marketing ploys. Like in a sense, you almost want it so you can actually blow up your profile a little bit. I think Inez is right that it's not going to be. I mean, we haven't won the battle against cancellation entirely, because obviously this wouldn't work if you have a normal employer or especially a big tech employer. Like you can't do this stuff would still get you fired, but we're getting somewhere, I think, especially, and I think in particular internally among the right, people are starting to get to the point where it's just like an automatic rejection of it, like, oh, you Guardian writer are trying to do something to a rightist, we do not care, sorry.
I didn't know who Lomez was before we brought this up this morning. I've now followed him, so I guess you can consider me one of the people who view this as an advertisement. But I do think that generally things are changing a bit. I mean, even just a few years ago when I was fired from a radio station, I actually did an interview, which in retrospect was a really bad idea. But I did an interview with Inside Edition and was fully expecting them to chop and screw it to make me look as horrible as possible. And the segment ran and it was fine, if not actually flattering to me, which I don't think would have ever happened, 5-10 years ago. But I also think that conservatives in particular are learning the power of what happens when, one, you mostly ignore these campaigns, they go away really quickly. And 2, when conservatives actually stand up for each other instead of doing the whole, well, I don't agree with what they said, but, or the, yeah, that just really was a bridge too far, and sort of doing the holier than thou, moralizing about these cancellation attempts. I think they found that it's better for everyone involved, because it inevitably will always come to more towards the center. It's not only going to be the people out on the fringes that are subject to cancellation attempts. I think conservatives really are learning that lesson just through experience. And so that's a good development. But certainly if you work for a large corporation or a place that is very sensitive to negative PR, you're still very, very much at risk. And so that element of it has not gone away at all.
Yeah, I think when this sort of cancel culture phrase started popping up in the lexicon, I think I referred to conservatives, open conservatives, as pre-canceled in this way. And when I was talking to a lot of friends who were, let's say, on the IDW style right, and they were really going through hell, to be honest. I felt bad for them. And that's because so many of their networks were still attached to the left, right? So when your professional networks and your personal networks are still very firmly rooted in the left, that's when they have power over you. And I really want to underscore what Amber said. It's to the extent that I'm optimistic about the direction of this whole phenomenon, it's that the right is hardening up, because actually the biggest consequences for sort of open conservatives who were getting quote unquote canceled, like, or attempts to cancel them, they were coming from conservative sources, right? Because at the end of the day, it was reliant on, National Review or Fox News or whatever to say this is beyond the pale, and to, instead of not caring about it, right? In the way that the left has long not, I mean, there is a magazine called Jacobin Magazine, and that is considered part of legitimate political discourse. And you can imagine how people on the left would react if a magazine called Helicopter Weekly, started showing up for bipartisan discussion, right? And yet that's considered totally fine, because the left has always had this attitude towards their own. I'm encouraged that the right is headed in that direction. That being said, as long as you have mainstream or leftist ties, it's still going to be, and I'm not saying that people need to cut those ties. I mean, that's something everybody has to decide for themselves. But that, to some extent, the right now has an ecosystem for this, and it's growing, that is able to counterbalance a lot of this. And that is overall, I think, an improvement. And unless anyone else has anything to add, I think we can move to final thoughts, unless anybody wants to jump in on this.
I'd just say really briefly that I think you have two forces involved here. One is that the left's excesses have made the weapon of cancellation or attempted cancellation and doxing less potent than it otherwise would be. And so there's definitely a kind of there they go again effect to things. Now, it'd be interesting to kind of see how these tactics pull among regular Americans as opposed to people like us who are intently focused on these trends, or people outside essentially the media, political, intellectual sphere. Do they think that the left's excesses are egregious, and are they starting to recoil and roll their eyes now at attempts to ruin people's careers and lives? And then on the other hand, you have more conservatives, and probably more young conservatives, who know what time it is and just simply won't tolerate or cower or submit to the idea that this person is going to wreck my life, and recognize that if you stand defiant and courageous, the bullies in this case oftentimes will back down. They never expect you to actually push back against them. So those two things combined, I think, make it such that at least directionally, the weapon of cancellation is becoming less fatal. However, the trends societally are still very much against speech, against actual accepting and debating openly actual dissenting opinion. So we'll see ultimately if there's a cultural shift when it comes to speech broadly, or if there's still completely taboo topics and subjects and people that are still considered too toxic to tolerate, but maybe the cancellation itself kind of dies down as a tactic.
Yeah, I guess there's nothing that sums up the defiance attitude towards this better than the way that this has been dealt with by Lomez and Passage Press, which is, you can purchase anything in the Passage Press lexicon, I guess, library of titles that they have. You can get free shipping now with promo code Wilson, which is the name of the journalist who doxed him. So that's probably the best way, if you're able to, with all the caveats, if you're able to deal with these kinds of attempts that way, it's a more and more successful route. And with that, I don't know if anybody has some final thoughts right out of the gate, but we'll go ahead and turn to final thoughts.
Yeah, the Slovakian prime minister got shot. That's something that happened this morning. Not sure I have a huge number of thoughts about, obviously it's not good when there's any sort of Central European assassination. Historically, it hasn't gone well. But I hope he's okay. Apparently he's like a right-wing nationalist. And I mean, I think in anti-funding Ukraine, it's a little worrisome that perhaps the hardcore progressive left is willing to now try and assassinate people who oppose the war in Ukraine and want peace. It's a little worrisome, but Anna's telling me that he was actually invited to the National Conservatism Conference in Brussels. Hopefully this guy recovers and doesn't have to leave office.
So first of all, the EEOC rule that we were talking about did go into effect immediately on April 29th when they issued the final guidance. We also just got breaking news that Trump is agreeing to a debate on Fox News on October 2nd with moderators Brett Baier and Martha McCallum. As far as I know, that was not one of Biden's preferred networks. So who knows if he will accept that. Maybe Trump's trying to pressure him into doing it. And then finally, I don't think we talked about this last week. I think it happened later in the week after we filmed the podcast, but the Boy Scouts have officially changed their name to Scouting America in an effort to be more inclusive. This is on the back of a few years ago, they decided to start accepting girls as well as transgender boys. I think needless to say, the Boy Scouts are clearly in an identity crisis. They have responded to declining membership in all of the wrong ways by basically taking away this exclusive boys only club, which was obviously something that a lot of young men were really attracted to, and turning it into like a free-for-all camping trip, which you can do through any number of other organizations. So really unfortunate.
It's just an amazing sign of the times how you have major stories that kind of just get completely washed away in the news cycle. But a couple of items worth noting. Kristen Clark, senior Justice Department Civil Rights Division official, apparently perjured herself in connection with, I believe, an arrest associated with a domestic violence between her and her then husband. And there's another layer to the scandal where she apparently, or someone on her behalf, pushed the ex-husband to vindicate the fact that essentially she wasn't the one who was engaging in the domestic violent behavior. Massive scandal, and she should be thrown out of office. Yet we don't necessarily see that push coming, at least as of yet. Also, the the Gaza death toll number is being revised down by half. Barely even makes a ripple. But obviously, this was a huge propaganda piece for the pro-Hamasnik crowd in America and around the world. The narrative gets obliterated as a consequence of this number, yet you don't even get a word on it really from the Biden administration, which touted the Gaza Health Ministry, which is to say Hamas-backed propaganda figures, including during the State of the Union. So once again, the most prolific purveyors of dis, and malinformation are the regime itself that tries to censor their opponents. Also worth noting, it appears that Trump and Biden did agree to another debate. So this would be 3 if the Fox News one holds. Fox News one supposedly would be in October. There's an ABC debate now that's supposedly scheduled for September. So the timing of these is also probably pretty significant based upon the hostility or lack thereof of the moderators that we can expect. Last but not least, on a topic that I'm continuing to track and will continue to track through the election, is this Biden executive order on promoting access to voting, which I think conservatives have rightly cast as a taxpayer-funded Democrat get-out-the-vote effort. This is the Biden administration empowering every single agency and directing every single agency to turn out the vote. That is, register and mobilize voters with whom the agencies come in contact, including in conjunction with putatively nonpartisan third-party groups that in reality, all of the supportive groups of the order are basically left-wing / identity-focused groups. The Heritage Foundation's Oversight Project, and I wrote about this at the Federalist, has unearthed some documents showing a DOJ listening session with many of these supportive groups and the kinds of quote-unquote reforms or actions that they were calling on agencies to take, many of which the agencies did take, like, for example, seeking to register voters at naturalization ceremonies, targeting voters in HUD housing authorities, pursuing voters in a whole slew of areas that disproportionately will vote Democrat. And when they're coming in contact with agencies where many of them are getting benefits from the administration that is directing the order. So the House Oversight Committee, I exclusively reported for Real Clear Politics, is now probing the order demanding all of the agency strategic action plans that they came up with to execute it, asking for the information on who are the third-party groups the administration is working with, what were the criteria for selecting these groups, and asking the administration to justify on a constitutional and statutory basis how in the heck this thing is legal when primarily it's the states that have control over election administration and processes, and there could be Hatch Act violations, there could be Anti-Deficiency Act violations. That is, monies are not approved for these agencies to be engaging in electioneering. So the House Oversight Committee stepping in here is hugely significant, minimally from the perspective of shining a light on the order. Whether or not they can combat it, given that Republicans have been asking for these action plans, and watchdogs have been litigating with the Biden administration to try to obtain them, and to date, the administration is stonewalled. We shall see, but I think it's incredibly telling that the administration is withholding these plans that they should be proud of, because they argue that this is helping get underrepresented voters more enfranchised and engaged. But also, Demos, the think tank behind this executive order, said it could lead to 3.5 million new or updated voter registrations annually, every single year. In other words, this could be decisive in the 2024 presidential election, and that's why I'm going to continue to shine a light on it.
My final thought is maybe very specific, but it really, really made me angry. So keeping up with this news, I mentioned a couple weeks ago the fact that protesters had vandalized a World War I memorial in New York. It's one of the most beautiful memorials in the city. It obviously highlights the overlap between how the protesters seem to see, Israel and Gaza just as a mere overlay on the deep colonial past of the United States, and hatred for the United States as an underlying premise of the protests. Doesn't get more sort of directly disrespectful and hateful than vandalizing a war memorial for American dead. So the good news is that at least one of the vandals has been arrested and charged both with a misdemeanor of graffiti, but also with a larger felony. So we'll see. He's 16. That may lessen some of the penalties, but I'm keeping an eye on it. I mean, I would like to see some more, serious penalties applied in this case, given the level of the disrespect. And I will have to add one little kudos, which is a rare thing for me, but for the mayor of New York City, Eric Adams. He added $10,000 from his personal account to the reward for discovering who did this to this memorial. It's really unusual, I think, to see a Democrat come out and really go after this kind of defacement of American national symbols. I think it's a good sign, along with the fact that there have been sporadic reports of, for example, some towns in Central Virginia. They changed the names of some of their schools from Confederate references during 2020. Some of them are now changing them back. All of this to say, we have a Democratic mayor coming out in favor of American symbols and memorials. We have some real resistance and even some reversal of some of those regime changey moments from 2020. So I think it's a positive development worth noting here. So I guess with that, we're ready to wrap up this hour. Please do give us feedback on the new conversational format. We want to hear from you. So drop us a comment, an email, a tweet, whatever, however you want to communicate with us. We'd love to hear your feedback on the format or on anything else that we've said today or any other week. And with that, on behalf of Ben, Will, and Amber, thanks for tuning in. I'm Inez Stepman, and this has been NatCon Squad, and we'll see you at the next one.